Chapter 12 of the Oxford University Press, The French Revolution, Chapter 12, Thermidor, 1794 to 1795. It was only natural, as the architects and original advocates of terror were themselves destroyed by it, or reduced to silence or impotence, that people should begin to wonder what terror was for and where the revolution was going. "I don't know," a police spy heard someone say late in March 1794. "What it's all coming to. People have railed against the revolutionary committees, and now we have come to think them suspect. They have railed against the revolutionary army, and now it's been dissolved. There seems to be something against everything that carries the name revolutionary." But there was one powerful and eloquent voice who certainly did not agree: Robespierre. Throughout the autumn and early winter, he too had agonized about the direction and meaning of the revolution, as his flirtation with the indulgents and their policies showed. But by February, his vision was beginning to clear, and on the 5th of that month, he came to the convention to deliver a profession of revolutionary faith. "What," he asked, "is the end towards which we are striving?" "The peaceful enjoyment of liberty and equality, the reign of that eternal justice whose laws are engraved, not on marble and on stone, but in the heart of all men." What sort of government can realize these prodigies? Only democratic or republican government. These two words are synonyms. But democracy was not, said Robespierre, implicitly rejecting the claims of the sans-culottes to interfere in government, the sovereign people in constant action. Democracy is a state where the sovereign people, guided by laws which are its own work, does by itself all that it can do well, and by delegates all that it cannot do for itself. It is in the principles of democratic government that you must look for the rules of your political conduct. What then is the fundamental principle of democratic or popular government? That is to say, the essential underpinning which sustains it and makes it work. It is virtue, which is nothing other than the love of the land of your birth and its laws. This sublime sentiment supposes a preference for the public interests above all particular interests. The first rule of your political conduct must be to relate all you do to maintaining equality and developing virtue in the system of the French Revolution. What is immoral is impolitic, and what corrupts is counter-revolutionary. Weakness, vices, and prejudices are the high road to monarchy. Coming from anywhere else, these ideas would be one more example of the vapid rhetoric which the French Revolution produced so readily. Robespierre, however, was a figure of authority and power, and he took his own ideas extremely seriously. Throughout the spring and early summer of 1794, he became increasingly obsessed with the cleansing the Republic of the corrupt, and all who fell short of his exacting standard of virtue. The first casualty of his obsession was Fabre d'Eglantine, whom he denounced in bitter terms at the Jacobins on 8th of January. But in Robespierre's eyes, Fabre's greed, duplicity, and corruption, through suspicion on his known associates, including leading indulgents like Desmoulins, and loud-mouthed trimmers like Danton, whose persistent defense of Fabre suggested that he put his friends before patriotic principles. Shortly after outlining his ideal republic of virtue, Robespierre was taken ill and did not reappear in public for almost a month. Robespierre, during this time, Hébertist machinations dominated the political agenda, and Aymar, the member of the Committee of General Security, deputed to report to the Indies Company scandals so that the accused could be brought to trial, proved curiously dilatory in reporting his conclusions. It is possible that he was even involved himself. Under mounting pressure from his colleagues, eventually he did report on 16 March, indicting Fabre, Chabot, and a number of others. In the convention, he was openly denounced by Robespierre and Billaud-Varennes for over-concentrating on financial details to the exclusion of the alleged plot's political ramifications. Widening his scope somewhat, Aymar reported again on 19 March, and this time, Fabre and his associates were sent for trial. As soon as the Hébertists were dispatched, the timing and preparation of this trial became the central preoccupation of the governing committees. It appears that both were split. Some, like Billaud-Varennes, seemed to have thought that the indulgence, having goaded the Hébertists into destroying themselves, now deserved to perish in their turn, whether involved in the Indies Company scandal or not. Vadier of the Committee of General Security was of the same opinion. The case offered a convenient pretext, since Fabre, before his arrest, had been a leading opponent of continuing terror. This would eliminate people like Desmoulins and Danton too, although he had played little role in the indulgence campaign. His notorious opportunism made him too dangerous to leave at liberty while his friends stood trial. Other members thought widening a trial for corruption into a political showpiece was far too dangerous. The balance was held by Robespierre, and the thought of trying Danton put even his increasingly rigid political principles to the test. The first proposal to arrest Danton in the indulgence appears to have come while the Hébertists were on trial. But Robespierre wavered for another week. It was not until 30th of March, after 2 mysterious meetings with Danton, that Robespierre seems to have decided to abandon him. But when he did so totally. So no sooner was the arrest warrant issued that day than he began to assemble materials for Danton's indictment. His notes form the basis of Saint Just's speech of the 31st in the convention when, in the name of both committees, he announced the arrests of the last partisans of royalism who for 5 years have served factions and have only followed liberty as a tiger follows its prey. He called for them to be put on trial. The motion, perhaps because Saint Just emphasized that this was likely to be a final cleansing of the political body, politic, passed virtually unopposed. The vagueness of Saint Just's denunciation was echoed in the charges made between 2 and 5th April, when the East Indies conspirators, Desmoulins, Danton, and others, 16 in all, including 9 deputies, came on trial. Danton himself was not even accused of corruption, which would have been very easy. The charges against him were all generalities based on his political record since 1789. Through sheer eloquence, he was soon dominating the courtroom, to Fouquier-Tinville's alarm. Only when the convention, acting on a deliberately misleading report that the prisoners were in revolt against the Revolutionary Tribunal, decreed that the trial should continue in their absence, could a verdict of guilty be secured. Their revolt had merely been a noisy demand that witnesses be called, but now they were deemed superfluous. On 5th April, Danton, Desmoulins, Fabre, Chabot, and the others went to the guillotine. Few episodes in the revolution are harder to interpret than the fall of Danton and Desmoulins. For reliable evidence about the motivation of those involved is almost completely lacking. At least Hébert and his associates had been openly calling for an insurrection. Desmoulins had merely been advocating, and by now he had stopped, a less bloody regime. And Danton had not been calling for, with any vehemence or consistency, for anything. It seems that they were struck down more for what they might do than for what they had done. Their execution, in fact, marked the beginning of a new phase in the terror, when people would die for their potential as much as for specific crimes, and sometimes merely for their failure to match some ideal moral standard. The word virtue made Danton laugh, Robespierre grimly noted. How could a man to whom all idea of morality was foreign be the defender of liberty? Danton's death marked the inauguration of a republic of virtue. It was characterized by continued concentration of power at the center. On 1st April, the Council of Ministers was at last abolished. Departments of state were all put into commission, each one supervised by a member of the governing committees. 2 weeks later, on 16 April, it was decreed that all conspiracy cases should henceforth be tried only by the Revolutionary Tribunal in Paris. And over the ensuing weeks, most of the various special courts which had enforced the terror in the provinces were closed down. The effect was to cram the prisons of the capital with suspects, and to cope with them, the procedure of the tribunal was simplified and speeded up. By the law of 22nd Prairial, 10th of June, the number of judges and jurors was increased. Witnesses were virtually dispensed with, and accused persons were deprived of defending counsel. The purpose of the tribunal was redefined as the punishment of enemies of the people, and the only penalty it was allowed to impose was death. But enemies of the people were so widely defined that, as with the law of suspects, almost anybody was vulnerable to the charge. The effect on the character of the terror was immediate. Executions, which had declined sharply between January and March, had risen again in April with a new burst of repression in the Vendée, fell back somewhat in May, but from early June began to climb markedly once more. Most of the victims of the renewed rise perished in Paris. Of the 2,639 people guillotined in the Place de la Révolution between March 1793 and August 94, over half, 1,515, died during June and July of 1794. A far higher proportion of them, too, were from the upper ranks of society than in the terror as a whole. 38% of its noble victims and 26% of its clerical ones were dispatched during this short phase. And almost half of those were from the richer bourgeoisie. Never was the terror closer to being an instrument of social discrimination rather than one punishing specific counter-revolutionary acts than in these months. And although most of those who died were doubtless as guilty as another of subversive or traitorous activity, the abrupt change in the terror's pattern suggests that some, at least, of those it now struck down died as much for what they were or had been before 1789 as for what they had done. The dead Hébertists might have approved of such a policy, but little else the governing committees did once they were gone would have pleased them. After the fall of Chaumet, for example, the Paris Commune was placed under the direct authority of the Committee of Public Safety, and its membership remodeled to produce a majority that could be relied upon to take its orders from above rather than below. At once it turned its attention to the maximum, but to the aspect which the Hébertists had deliberately neglected, wage control. It took some months to gather the material and draw up the tables they had always refused to contemplate. But wage earners, meanwhile, were given plenty of warning of what was coming. In April, the Le Chapelier law was invoked to punish the ringleaders of tobacco workers who had petitioned for a wage rise. Other groups were threatened with conscription as war workers, subject to military discipline if they pressed for such demands. But the very occurrence of these incidents showed that inflationary pressures were far from contained. Yet, the new rates, when they were finally published on 23rd July, imposed substantial cuts in the earnings of most workers. During the early 1790s, many had seen their wages double or treble as the value of the assignat plummeted, and the 50% above 1790 levels permitted under the maximum fell far short of what they were now making. Nor did they have any effective vehicles of protest by then. The sections had been absorbed into the governmental machine, and throughout April and May, the Commune had harried the popular societies into oblivion. By the beginning of June, most had announced their own dissolution. Even de-Christianization was now being reversed. There seems to have been general agreement in the governing committees that it had been a disaster. And on 7th April, Couthon announced that new proposals would shortly be brought forward for channeling the spiritual leanings of the nation in more patriotic directions. The result was the cult of the Supreme Being, launched by a speech from Robespierre to the convention on 7th of May. Designed as the first of a series of Republican festivals to be held on each official rest day, Décadi, it would proclaim that the French people recognized the existence of a supreme being in the immortality of the soul. These principles, declared Robespierre to applause, were a continual reminder of justice, and were therefore social and republican. While denouncing priestcraft, he recurred to his heartfelt theme that the purpose of the Republic was to promote virtue. He deplored the excesses, though not in so many words, of de-Christianization, and sang the praises of Rousseau, himself an architect of a civic religion. Thus, every locality was given a month to make its preparations. The fact that 8 June was also Whit Sunday may or may not have been a coincidence. If not, it could have been conceived either as a challenge or as an olive branch to Christianity. In the event, little direction was given to the localities on how to organize the festival. Some adapted the props of all too recent festivals of reason, merely painting out old slogans with new ones. Others used the opportunity to allow Mass to be said publicly for the first time in months. But in Paris, the organization of the occasion was entrusted to the experienced hands of the Painter David, himself a member of the Committee of General Security. He built an artificial mountain in the Champ de Mars, surmounted by a tree of liberty, and thither a mass procession made its way from the Tuileries. In its head marched the members of the convention, led by their president, who happened that week to be Robespierre. He used the opportunity to deliver 2 more eulogies of virtue and republican religion, pointedly ignoring, though not failing to notice, the smirks of some of his fellow deputies at the posturings of this pseudo-pope. Others found it no laughing matter. "Look at the bugger," muttered Thuriot, an old associate of Danton. "It's not enough for him to be master, he has to be God." It was a feeling that increasing numbers of deputies and members of the governing committees too were coming to share. Ever since the autumn of 1792, Robespierre had been subject to periodic charges of aspiring to personal dictatorship. But now, it seemed more credible than ever. He seemed to be speaking for the Committee of Public Safety more and more, and was certainly better known in the country at large than any of his colleagues. At Orleans, as well as in Paris, the Festival of the Supreme Being took place to cries of "Vive Robespierre." 2 weeks beforehand, he had been pursued by 2 would-be assassins. One of them eventually attacked Colette D'Herboise, but the other got as far as the door of the man she called a tyrant. Both were executed, along with 52 others suspected of involvement in the machinations of bats dressed in red, the color of parricide. The law under which they died was that of 22nd Prairial, whose provisions Robespierre largely drafted, with Couthon sprang upon an unsuspecting Committee of Public Safety with no prior consultation. Yet, the fact that they chose to do it in this way reflected uncertainty about this support. Ever since April, indeed, the committee had been the scene of increasingly heated quarrels, setting Robespierre, Saint-Just, and to a lesser extent Couthon against the rest. At one point they threatened Carnot, who riposted that they were ridiculous dictators. Yet, when on 16 April a special Bureau of General Police was established within the committee to supervise the conduct of public officials, the 3 were appointed to it, perhaps in the hope of sidelining them. They threw themselves into their new task with characteristic zeal, however, and this served to alarm the Committee of General Security, which regarded the Bureau as trespassing its own territory, already seriously infringed since the show trials of the spring. All this multiplied Robespierre's enemies, and the law of 22nd Prairial added even more. Many deputies in the convention, not to mention members of the 2 committees, were alarmed by its sweeping terms. They were not reassured when in the debate on the law, Robespierre denounced those who sought to sow division, remembering how the Dantonists had been arrested without a prior decree from the convention. They were particularly frightened by a clause overriding all conflicting legislation. They were afraid it might destroy the normal immunity from arrest. Accordingly, on 23rd Prairial, a number of those who had scoffed at Robespierre's prominence at the Festival of the Supreme Being moved a specific guarantee of deputies' immunity under the new law. It was carried. From that moment onwards, the anti-Robespierre forces began to coalesce. He was well aware of what was happening. although he was at a loss to understand it. "Why come to me?" he asked one of the petitioners who were always at his door these days. "Why not apply to the Comité? Everyone applies to me if I had omnipotent power." He concluded, like the good disciplined disciple of Rousseau he was, that the purity and rectitude of his intentions were being deliberately vilified and obstructed by a corrupt faction of unpatriotic intriguers. Among them were deputies recalled from provincial missions on account of their excesses, men like Fouché and Tallien, and Dantonists like Thuriot and the ex-butcher Legendre. But when the Committee of Public Safety refused, on 12th of June, to be browbeaten into giving him the 9 heads he believed to be at the heart of the conspiracy against him, he ceased to attend their meetings, confining his public appearances increasingly to the one forum where he knew he could always command support, the Jacobin Club. But the Jacobins were not the power they had been. To take a stand there and not in the convention was to provoke suspicions of insurrectionary intentions. Suspicion, in fact, suffused the whole of public life during these terrible weeks when there were executions by 20s and 30s almost daily. As many as 60 deputies, it was said, were afraid to sleep in their own beds at night. And yet it was become increasingly clear that terror was no longer necessary in order to win the war. The British had failed on 1st of June to prevent a major grain convey from arriving from America. And the sinking of the ship of the line Vengeur was turned, in the report made on it to the convention by Barrère, into an epic of Republican heroism and defiance. Even more important, on 26 June came the great victory of Fleurus, which opened the way for a renewed invasion of Belgium and removed the last threat from the Austrians. After that, everybody was longing to breathe more easily, yet with the governing committees torn apart by mutual suspicions and dark hints and threats being thrown out by all sides, nobody knew how to end the slaughter except by annihilating their opponents before they were themselves destroyed. In mid-July, one last attempt was made to restore unity, if not exactly harmony. Barrère, always the trimmer, arranged a joint meeting of the governing committees on the 22nd, at which it was agreed to speed up the implementation of the laws of Ventose. The convention and the Jacobin Club were assured afterwards that, notwithstanding previous appearances to the contrary, France still had a united government. But at another joint meeting the next day, Robespierre reappeared for the first time in almost a month and made bitter personal attacks on Billaud, Collot, Amar, and Vadier. He did endorse the new joint policies, but after his earlier outburst, Any truce could scarcely be expected to last. Deputies outside the committees were, however, terrified that the newly trumpeted unity might be real and lead to a purge of those on Robespierre's proscription list. Fouché and Tallien now launched themselves into feverish lobbying among the uncommitted deputies of what had once been known, in contradistinction to the mountain, as the plain, but whose inertia as the rhythm of the terror increased again had won them the less flattering description of the marsh. But Robespierre, too, thought he could swing the convention, and on 26 July he reappeared there to deliver a long, rambling speech, naming few names but full of threats against seemingly everybody. After extolling his own probity and love of virtue in now characteristic fashion, he declared that there existed a conspiracy against public liberty involving unspecified numbers of deputies, the Committee of General Security, and even some members of the Committee of Public Safety. These traitors must be punished, their factions crushed. Both committees must be purged, for defenders of liberty will always be proscribed as long as power lies with a horde of knaves. It was a declaration of war. And realizing now that their lives might depend on a rapid counterattack, Robespierre's enemies took up the challenge. First, there was a noisy debate over whether his speech should be printed, and if so, in what quantity. Accusations of dictatorship were now renewed by those whom he had attacked. Amid clear signs of sympathy from the deputies as a whole, that night, Robespierre read his speech again to the Jacobins, who tumultuously refused to allow Billaud and Caillot to reply on it. On Couthon's motion that they voted to expel all deputies who had been against printing the speech, and there was vague talk of a new purge of the convention. Billaud and Caillot, both shaking with fury, went straight to the committees, and they seemed to have spent most of the night preparing for the inevitable confrontation next morning. Among deputies outside the committees, Tallien was doing the same, aware that Caillot, currently president of the convention, could choose who spoke and when. The strength of feeling became clear on the morning of 27 July through 9 Thermidor, when Saint Just, who had been little involved in the growing factionalism of the preceding weeks, unexpectedly came out for Robespierre. Billaud denounced him in the name of the Committee of Public Safety, in Tallien from the floor. They were cheered But when Robespierre demanded the right to speak, he was drowned out by cries of "Down with the tyrant!" Collot consistently refused him the floor, while attack after attack whipped the deputies into a frenzy. Eventually, his arrest was proposed. His brother Augustine demanded to be arrested with him, and the convention obliged. Others proposed the arrest of Couthon, who had also stood by him, and Saint Just. All were decreed. So was that of Henriot, commander of the Paris National Guard. It was a parliamentary rout. Robespierre, shut away in his Rue Saint-Honoré lodgings for most of the preceding month, had fatally overestimated his support among the deputies, while in his speech of 27 July, he had attacked so many of them directly or indirectly that none could feel entirely safe. But repudiation by the convention was not quite the end of Robespierre. The evening of the 26th had shown that he still commanded support from the Jacobin Club and its public galleries. And the Commune, remodeled after the fall of the Hébertists, was largely packed by his nominees. There was still, therefore, a chance that Paris, where his popular reputation had been consistently high since the spring of 1791, would rally to him. And initially, the Commune did not fail him. On the afternoon of the 28th, it ordered all gaolers in the capital to refuse to accept prisoners, and Henriot was allowed to escape. While he tried to marshal the National Guards for an insurrection, the arrested deputies were taken into the Commune's protection at the Hôtel de Ville, but only 17 out of 48 sectional National Guard companies responded to Henriot's call and assembled on the Place de Grève. Some of the others wavered, but when the convention took decisive action, they quickly fell into line. On the proposal of Barrère, the prisoners, presumed to have escaped, were outlawed, under a provision of ironically first moved by Saint Just. That meant they could be executed without trial, and forces loyal to the convention were given a commander in Barras, who had distinguished himself at the siege of Toulon. Faced by such determination and its inability to arouse most of the sections from hostility or indifference, the Commune hesitated. Over the evening, its assembled forces drifted away home, so that when Barras and his troops arrived at the Hôtel de Ville at 2 in the morning on 29 July, it was undefended. Robespierre had tried to shoot himself, but had only broken his jaw. But it was in this maimed state that he went to the guillotine the next afternoon. His brother Couthon, Saint Just, and 80 other Robespierrists from the Commune followed him over the next 24 hours. about 60 persons, noted the Irish political exile Hamilton Rowan, who watched the spectacle, were guillotined in less than 1 hour and a half in the Place de la Révolution. And though I was standing above, okay, let me try that again. His brother Couthon, Saint Just, and 80 other Robespierreists from the Commune followed him over the next 24 hours. About 60 persons, noted the Irish political exile Hamilton Rowan, who watched the spectacle, were guillotined in less than 1 hour and a half in the Place de la Révolution. And though I was standing above 100 paces from the place of execution, the blood of the victims streamed beneath my feet. What surprised me was, as each head fell into the basket, the cry of the people was no other than a repetition of "À bas le maximum." The new tariff for wages published earlier that week was certainly not the only reason why. The sections did not respond to the Commune's insurrectionary call. The crisis had arisen too suddenly, and there had been no prior planning. And told by the convention that Robespierre had been aiming at tyranny and dictatorship. A populace that had meekly accepted what had been told about the machinations of the Hébertists and Dantonis was unlikely to stir to save another idol shown to have feet of clay. Even so, the imposition of the wage maximum by the Robespierre's Commune only a few days before the crisis broke alienated ordinary Parisians at a crucial moment. And their notorious tastes for scapegoats was satisfied by the destruction of Robespierre and his municipal henchmen. As to Robespierre himself, he never was a dictator, and there is no reliable evidence to suggest that it was his aim. But he was suspicious by nature, and over the spring, the stresses of government drove him to the verge of paranoia. Surrounded by rumors of plots, not to mention assassination attempts, yet completely sure of his own rectitude, he took contradiction for bad faith and independence for opportunism. In the end, he seems to have concluded that hardly anybody in public life could be relied on. And by saying so openly, he ensured that they could not. And by implying that those of whom he disapproved with, or with whom he disagreed, deserved execution, he forced them into destroying him before he destroyed them. Men called him a dictator because they feared moral inflexibility in one who had power. After they had destroyed him, they used the charge to justify what they had done. It also enabled them to blame him for acts they themselves had helped to commit, but which became increasingly a subject for shame, recrimination, and revenge during the months of retreat from terror and ruthless government which now began. Okay, on there. The ninth of Thermidor marked not so much the overthrow of one man or group of men as the rejection of a form of government. Those who thought otherwise were swiftly disillusioned when Barrere, who tried on 29 July to dismiss the whole episode as a disturbance which leaves the government unaffected, proposed nominees to replace the 3 executed members of the Committee of Public Safety. His motion was defeated. Instead, the convention accepted Tallien's proposal that a quarter of the committee should retire every month and not be eligible for immediate re-election. It did, for the moment, reject a motion to abolish the Revolutionary Tribunal, but that anybody should so much as dare to propose it showed how totally the atmosphere had changed. Soon, all the convention's committees were subjected to the same renewal rule. And among the first new members of public safety was Tallien himself. Former friends of Danton joined him there, and on the Committee of General Security. On 1st of August, the remodeled committees carried the repeal of the law of 22nd Prairial, and on the 10th they purged the membership of the Revolutionary Tribunal, arresting Fouquier-Tinville. As a result, the terror collapsed. Only 6 people were guillotined in Paris in August, and only 40 more over the rest of the year. Counter-revolutionary intent now had to be proved to secure a conviction. The difficulties of that rendered superfluous much of the work and powers of the watch committees, which on 24th August were reduced from 48 to 12 in Paris, 1 district per district elsewhere. In all this, the initiative increasingly came from the convention floor, and on 11 August, the Committee of Public Safety was deprived, against its own advice tendered by Barrere, of its overall superintending role in government. All its duties, except war and foreign relations, were redistributed to other committees. Thus, within a month of Robespierre's fall, the central institutions of terror and revolutionary government had been dismantled by a convention increasingly certain that they were no longer necessary. There was an outburst of relief throughout the country. The second anniversary of the Revolution of 10 August was celebrated with now uncharacteristic abandon. But the most spectacular evidence of changed times, apart from the drop in executions, was the release of suspects from prison. From the start, it was generally expected, and excited crowds gathered daily outside prison gates and the doors of the Committee of General Security. In Paris, it began early in August, and by the end of the month, 3,500 prisoners had been set free. They emerged from bitter and resentful against those who had put them there. for the most part fellow citizens on the watch committees, now stigmatized as terrorists. They wanted revenge. When on 31st August, a gunpowder factory at Grinnell in the southwestern suburbs blew up with around 400 casualties, nervous terrorists saw it as the first act of vengeance. It seems, in fact, to have been an accident. What was not accidental was the emergence, around the same time, of squads of anti-sans-culotte vigilantes, the so-called Gilded Ute. Some were released prisoners themselves. Some were draft dodgers. Many were clerks and petty bureaucrats, and all were looking for trouble. Affecting expensive clothes and hairstyles of a sort few would have dared to wear only a few weeks earlier. They came to number 2,000 or 3,000. They made it their business to harass known terrorists, disrupt their meetings, and break up public occasions of which they did not approve. One of the leading plotters against Robespierre, the ex-representative on mission at Toulon, Fréron, gave them open encouragement in his newspaper, L'Orateur du Peuple, which began to appear early in September, and soon was coordinating the marauding of this private street army. But his was far from the only voice now denouncing the excesses of the terror in those who had perpetuated them. A whole range of right-wing papers mushroomed in Paris throughout August and September, leading to calls in the convention and the Jacobin Club for a curb on their incitements. The Thermidorians, as Tallien, Fréron, and the others who had triumphed in that revolutionary month, were now coming to be known, responded with a loud defense of press freedom. Those wishing to limit it were, they said, in the title of a pamphlet published late in August, Robespierre's Tale, blood drinkers who wanted a return of government by terror. On 29 August, an open attack was launched in the convention on leading terrorists in the committees who had only turned against Robespierre at the last moment. The impeachment of Barrère, Béliaud, and Collot, Vadier, Amar, and David was proposed. Once again, this was going too far, too fast for the convention. It refused to indict them, to demonstrate its continuing commitment to radicalism. It ordered the remains of Mirabeau to be removed from the Pantheon, and those of Marat to replace them. Rousseau's body was also ordered to be exhumed and deposited there. Encouraged by these signs, the Jacobin Club took the offensive. On 4th September, it expelled Tallien and Fréron. A few days later, Tallien was attacked in the street. All this, the Thermidorians claimed, was the beginning of a return to terror.
The Grenelle explosion was Jacobin work. Fréron now turned his gaze upon the club, and for the first time in France, though not of course abroad, the term Jacobin became one of general opprobrium, associated indelibly with terror and the dictator who had so long dominated the club's platform. Sectional assemblies which supported the Jacobin line were mobbed by well-dressed rowdies who roughed up their leaders. And at this point, if any reminder was needed of what terror had been like, a group of alleged Federalists from Nantes came before the Revolutionary Tribunal and were acquitted. During their examination, lurid details of the drownings at Nantes under Carrier emerged, enough to indict the members of the Nantes Revolutionary Committee, who had been his collaborators, and induce the convention to establish an investigation of Carrier himself, who, as a deputy, remained immune from arrest unless on the convention's explicit decree. Such developments were a godsend to the Thermidorians, who now stepped up their anti-Jacobin pressure. Early in October, Tallien founded a paper of his own, L'Ami du Citoyen. While in the convention, Legendre once more moved the impeachment of Barrère, Billaud, and Calotte. Again they were saved, this time by colleagues on the former Committee of Public Safety, whom nobody yet wished to attack, including Carnot, who testified that all members had endorsed the reign of terror. But the pressure was working for all that. On 16 October, it was decreed that all clubs and societies should publish lists of their members, and all correspondence between them was forbidden. Everybody knew that the measure was intended to destroy the national network of affiliates which gave the Jacobin Club such authority, and lists of members identified whom to attack. When early in November, Billaud uttered threats against the club's enemies from the rostrum where he and Robespierre had so often dictated national policy, a crowd of muscadines marched from their usual meeting place at the Palais Égalité, formerly Royal, and broke every window of the building with showers of stones. 2 days later, 12th November, they returned in their hundreds, stormed the hall, and beat up both men and women they found inside. The convention, which had just decreed Carrier's arrest, was in no mood to sympathize. Instead of punishing the attackers, it ordered the closure of the Jacobin Club as an incitement to public disorder. and a potential rival to itself. But, in effect, it was enough simply to have the look of a Jacobin to be called after, insulted, and even beaten up. In the provinces, reaction to the fall of the revolutionary government was slower. Not all special courts disappeared when revolutionary justice was centralized in Paris. Some of the most notorious were set up after that, such as the Popular Commission at Orange, whose rules were the model for the law of 22nd Prairial, and which accounted for 332 victims between June and August. It and several others, notably in the West, continued to function for 5 or 6 weeks after 9 Thermidor, and continued to hand down death sentences. But soon, new representatives on mission were sent out to the departments to supervise the dismantling of the terror. And with the decree of 24th August, reducing the watch committees to 1 per district, thousands of provincial terrorists were thrust from public office. Soon afterwards, those they had imprisoned began to be released. Many of them, or their friends or relatives, now took power in remodeled popular societies, in municipal councils, and at once began to imprison their former persecutors. By the first week in September, for instance, the members of the Orange Commission were behind bars, and when it became clear during the autumn that the tide in Paris had set against the former terrorists, provincials were quick enough to take the hint. Suddenly, noted a British prisoner aboard the warship Marat at Brest early in December, the sailors had stopped shouting "Vive la Montagne" and "Vivant les Jacobins." That was now forbidden, a cabin boy told them. Now, they were to shout, "The mountain to the devil," and "Down with the Jacobins." But the ultimate symbol of reaction for both capital and departments was not so much the closure of the Jacobins as the fate of that supreme provincial terrorist, Carrier. On 23rd November, he was sent to the Revolutionary Tribunal, protesting to the last that he had only been obeying the convention's own orders at Nantes, and that the whole body was guilty, down to the president's bell. It availed him nothing. He was condemned. And on 16 December, guillotined. His defense was perhaps fair enough, and he was certainly not responsible for all the atrocities attributed to him. But in sacrificing him, the convention set an ominous example. A week before he died, the 71 Girondin sympathizers, saved by Robespierre from the guillotine in October 1793, including the hapless Tom Paine, were reinstated as full members of the convention. The political turnabout was now complete. But the return of the Girondins and the elimination of the most notorious of terrorists were not harbingers of a return of restraint and consensus. So far from reconciliation, 1795 was to be a year of revenge.